Welcome to this virtual tour of Cleeve Abbey in Somerset. This abbey, I'm really excited to show you around because it's one of the most complete in terms of where the monks would have worked and slept and ate. So we have many cathedrals and parish churches which used to be attached to abbeys that survive, and then we lose everything else, such as Waltham Abbey, Peterborough Cathedral, those kind of places. But here we've got the opposite. The church is almost completely gone. We can just see the footprint, which we'll have a look at the moment, in a moment. But then we have a gatehouse to look at, we have a refectory where the monks would have ate, the dormitory where they would have slept, the chapter house, and the solar where they would have worked. So there's quite a lot to look at. There's amazing amounts of detail and decoration still there to see, and so I think you'll really enjoy a virtual look around here, and I'm going to really enjoy telling you all about Cleeve Abbey. We'll begin at the Gatehouse, which would have been probably the only place that most people to have come to Cleeve Abbey would have seen. Now, the one that we see today, there was obviously one from the beginning, so there was a 13th century one built, but that was remodelled during the 16th century, in fact just before the suppression. And on it, there's still quite a lot of detail. We can see in Latin an inscription which reads, if you translate it, to "Gate be open, shut to no honest person." But I mean, in reality, people were only admitted into the abbey for specific reasons, and if you weren't a monk, there was only one other probably specific reason other than maybe delivering goods or supplies that would have allowed you access, but we'll talk about that in a moment. There was a room off the side of this gatehouse that was used to administer alms to the poor and needy, so things like food, clothing or money. And as well as that inscription, if we look closely at the top as well, on one side we can see Jesus on the cross, and on the other side the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus. Before we take a look at the buildings, I want to first of all draw your attention, we're now in the precinct of the Abbey, to that mound that you might just be able to see in the distance, which would have actually been in front of a huge church, which has now gone. We'll go and have a look at the ruins of that in a moment. This, though, is the base of a market cross. I think fairly unusual for an abbey to have a market inside its precinct, but a charter was awarded in 1466 to the Abbey to hold weekly markets and 2 annual fairs, and the reason for that was they had to rebuild their chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, to which pilgrims used to visit to see an image of the Virgin Mary. Now, this wasn't on this site, it was 4 miles away originally at a place called Blue Anchor. The chapel had been basically destroyed by a landslide, and as miracles go, the altar and the image of the Virgin Mary survived, and so the Abbey wanted to rebuild this chapel. And of course, after that miraculous survival of the image and the altar, which was then reconstructed into a new chapel in a different location, people again wanted to come, and pilgrims flocked. And by the time of the Abbey's suppression in 1536, it was one of the first ones to be suppressed, the income from pilgrims was around £20 a year, so a substantial sum. Before we move to the more complete buildings, let's begin with the church. When this was excavated in the sort of Victorian era, they had to get through a lot of the rubble, which was still here from when the church was demolished. But you can see the footprint quite clearly, you can see the bottom of the columns, you can see from as we walk around just how large it was, so you can kind of get a feel. Now, there are still some exciting bits left. The whole of this floor would have been tiled in the 13th century, and this is part of that flooring. Incredibly, this bit has managed to survive. And here it is. It's open to the elements, but it seems to be doing okay with it. So this is 13th century tiling. This would have covered the whole of the church floor, they believe. Now, there is here a tomb, or what would have been a grave. Don't know of who, but this is likely then to have been sort of near an altar, because although you couldn't come and worship here as a lay person, you could be buried in here, and wealthy benefactors did get buried inside monasteries, believing that the prayers of the monks would help them through, obviously, purgatory and into the next life. Now we're going to go into an incredibly preserved part of the chapel, and that's the sacristy. In here would have been kept the church plate, candles, altar cloths, books, vestments, would all have been kept in here. And you can see the cupboards, these would have had doors on them. The walls would have been whitewashed and decorated. You can see on the floor the tiles. And in a moment we'll have a look at the ceiling as well, because you can still see traces of the decoration and the paintwork in the whitewash plaster. The piscina is still identifiable from that hole underneath, which was effectively a drain, because it was sort of a sink. I hope that's not a bad way of describing it, but for washing the liturgical vessels. This window would have been round. It would have had a stone frame, if you like, in there. But as we look up at the ceiling, if you can see, there's red paint, there's a little bit of black paint. It's only just noticeable, but once you see it, you can start to see more. Look at the edges and the kind of zigzag pattern you can see there. If we take a look again at the piscina slightly closer, and if I zoom in, you can see at the back of it this simple but beautiful foliage type style of paintwork at the back. We come back outside, and if you look up to the right of the door that led us into the sacristy, here is the monks' night door, and that leads directly into their dormitory, and this is where they would have come into church for those nocturnal prayers. And this is what you'd find on the other side of that door. This is the monks' dormitory. Eventually there would have been partitioned bedrooms, each monk having their own space, where you can see evidence that each monk would have kind of made it a little bit more homely. They might have decorated a little, but Originally, would have just been one big space. There would have been no privacy for the monks that were first here when it was founded. But protocol got a little less strict over time, and also their level of, not exactly luxury, but living standards increased. As we go past the day stairs here on our right, which will take us down to the cloister, we come to the other end of the dormitory. And at this end, to the very left, is the entrance to, believe it or not, the monks' ensuite toilet block. It had running water at ground level, and they would have gone to the toilet here in relative privacy. Bear in mind, there aren't that many monks here. Even at its peak, there are only 28. But it would have been really quite hygienic, and it's off their bedroom. So a little more luxury than perhaps people outside of the monastery would have been enjoying at this time. Outside, we can easily see the footprint of this latrine building. Actually, the downstairs building room was used for monks to work in, but this channel that I'm walking down at the moment would have had water running through it, diverted from the nearby stream, which would have just flushed away the waste. And you can see here we're coming up to a stone which would have gone over, so it shows that this was a water channel. Let's now have a look at where the monks would have eaten, because we have two examples of it here. The windows that we can see now are the newer refectory, built in the 16th century. But first we're going to take a look at this incredible survival. This is the original floor from the 13th century refectory, so the first one on the site. And these tiles are not just for decoration. All the way through there are heraldic symbols. So we have 3 lions, the royal arms of Henry III, who was a benefactor of the Abbey. Double-headed eagles can be seen, which are the arms of Richard, Earl of Cornwall, who was the brother of Henry III. We have the arms of the Earl of Cornwall, a single lion in a shield, and also the arms of the Clare family, Margaret de Clare, who was married to Edmund, Earl of Cornwall, and they're all in this floor. To reach the second refectory, we come into the cloister. So behind us would have been the church, and here would have been a very typical cloister, square in shape, covered walkway all the way around for the monks to have walked and exercised. To our right, just before the entrance to the refectory, is a large archway. That was the washing place. That's where the monks would have washed their hands before coming in for their meal. The monks would have eaten here in silence, all except for one monk who would read from the scriptures from a pulpit, which would have been above the fireplace you can see to the right. That is now blocked up, although the stairway can still be seen. But the roof in here is absolutely incredible. It is just a fabulous oak beam roof, but there's corbels all over, but those sculptures along the bottom edge are all angels looking down on the monks as they would have eaten. And I have it on good authority that when they have concerts in here, the acoustics are amazing, which makes it a bit of a shame that this was where the monks, who are known for their singing, would have been at their most silent. In a passage that leads off this refectory into some of the old abbot's lodgings, which I'll show you in a moment, is some of the best examples up close that you can get to as well of some of the artwork. Now this one of the monk just makes me giggle. I just can't believe that it's that old. But in here, this painted chamber, possibly used as an office, believe it or not, has got this amazingly well preserved wall painting. You can't go anywhere near it, as you can tell. We're behind plastic here, plastic sheeting, but it's really quite vivid. The colours are amazing. Now, as promised, I'm going to take you to the highest room that's still here, and it would have been accessed by this spiral staircase from the cloister, which is you can see remnants of now. And this was probably the living space of an abbot or a senior monk. Incredibly, there's more artwork in here that survives on the walls, and it's quite difficult at the start to notice, and then once you see a little bit, you could see more and more and more. The red paint here above the fireplace is a little easier to make out than the black paint, but the presence of wall paintings in this room is another indication that whoever this was accommodation for was a high status, high ranking person at the Abbey. The abbeys were also home to a number of Corodians, so a bit like pensioners. These could have been servants to the monastery, which were effectively living out their retirement here. They could even have been lay people who paid to lodge here in order to do the same. They're relatively comfortable. Each has a large living space with a fireplace, and off each room is again a toilet. So the hygiene here seems to have been quite good. Now the floor is cobble. That's because when this was a farmhouse, these rooms were used as stables. Before we finish our look around Cleeve Abbey, I want to take you to one last place. Now, first of all, this is where the infirmary would have been. Abbeys provided care for the sick, and unfortunately none of the infirmary buildings now survive, but that passageway took us from the cloister to where the infirmary was, and we're going to come out into this space in order to go back into another room that was off the cloister, and that is the Abbey's chapter house. Now of course we wouldn't be entering this way when the Abbey was complete, as you can see from the scars in the brickwork. This end of the chapter house has been demolished. This, in fact, in the 19th century was used as a cart house during its time as a farmhouse. But in here, when the Abbey, before 1536, when the Abbey was alive and well, this is where the monks would have met daily to talk about monastery business. Perhaps there were some punishments to dish out, and they would have heard a chapter from the rule of St. Benedict. This would have been richly decorated, the different coloured stone we can see there, but also look at this tracery, still really clear on the roof of the chapter house. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.